Some truths don't knock. They wait for you at a bus stop at 6:43 in the morning. The black Bentley rolled to a quiet stop beneath a flickering streetlight, its polished surface reflecting the pale Chicago dawn, and Ethan Callaway, founder of Callaway Dynamics and a man who measured risk in millions of dollars, found himself staring at something he couldn't quantify. Across the street stood Amara Brooks, wrapped in a wool coat too thin for the early March chill, her posture straight, her hand steady around the small fingers of a boy no older than 5, and when the child shifted his weight and looked up, Ethan felt the air leave his lungs because the boy's eyes were his eyes, the same steel blue intensity, the same stubborn crease between his brows, as if concentration was written into his DNA. Traffic hummed in the distance, a bus groaned somewhere down the block. But all Ethan could hear was the echo of a life he thought he had sealed shut 5 years ago when divorce papers slid across a marble conference table and he chose reputation over repair. Amara did not look surprised to see him, not startled, not afraid, just composed in a way that unsettled him more than anger ever could. And when their gazes locked, there was no accusation in hers, only history. Ethan stepped out of the car, Italian leather meeting cracked pavement, his tailored coat suddenly feeling like armor that didn't fit, and as he crossed the street, the boy tightened his grip on Amara's hand, studying him with quiet curiosity. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable, the line of the jaw, the faint dimple on the left cheek, the way his chin lifted slightly as if daring the world to question him. Ethan's voice, steady in boardrooms and interviews, fractured on a single question he never imagined asking. Is he mine? The city seemed to pause between heartbeats, and Amara held his gaze without blinking, her voice calm, almost gentle. Yes. One word, no explanation, no apology, no plea, and in that single syllable the narrative Ethan had built for himself collapsed. He had told himself she moved on, that the silence meant closure, that walking away had been clean and strategic, but the living proof standing 3 feet away erased every rationalization. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes, doors folding open, and the boy glanced at it, then back at Ethan as if measuring him against something unseen. Ethan felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest, not panic, not anger, but the weight of responsibility he had never factored into a quarterly report. Amara adjusted the strap of a worn backpack over her shoulder, her movements unhurried, dignified, and for the first time since becoming the youngest CEO in his company's history, Ethan Callaway understood that power meant nothing if it arrived 5 years too late. The bus doors folded open with a tired hiss, and for a moment none of them moved. Ethan stood there on the cracked pavement, the cold air biting through his coat, staring at the small hand wrapped around Amara's fingers as if letting go would change the answer he had just heard. The boy looked up at him again, not frightened, not excited, simply observant, and there was something in that steady gaze that felt older than 5 years, something that mirrored the way Ethan used to study investors. Before deciding whether they were worth his time, "What is his name?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edges he carried into every negotiation. Amara shifted the backpack on her shoulder and answered without hesitation, "Noah." The name landed softly, but it echoed inside him. Noah Callaway, he thought automatically, then caught himself because the child standing in front of him did not carry his last name, and he had forfeited the right to assume. The bus driver cleared his throat, glancing at them through the wide mirror, and commuters behind Amara began to shuffle forward, their morning routine unwilling to pause for anyone's reckoning. Ethan swallowed and took one careful step back, giving them space instead of blocking their path, a small instinct he had not expected from himself. "Does he know?" he asked quietly. Amara met his eyes again, and this time there was a flicker of something deeper beneath her composure. Not anger, not bitterness, but protection. "He knows I chose him," she said, her voice even. "That is what matters right now." The words cut cleaner than any accusation could have. Ethan felt the weight of 5 silent years pressing against his ribs, years when he convinced himself that distance was mercy, that walking away would spare them both from the glare of headlines and shareholders who measured humanity in percentages. He remembered the meeting where his legal team suggested a clean separation, the subtle warning that a family complication could unsettle investors, and how quickly he agreed. believing he could rebuild everything else later. He had rebuilt the company, doubled its valuation, expanded into 3 new states, but he had not rebuilt this. Noah adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced toward the bus, then back at Ethan as if waiting for him to say something that would make sense of the tension in the air. Ethan knelt slightly, so they were eye level, careful, deliberate, and for once not performing for a camera. "Hi, Noah," he said, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. The boy studied him for a second longer and gave a small nod, polite but reserved. There was no rush toward him, no instinctive recognition, just quiet assessment, and Ethan realized that biology did not guarantee belonging. Amara stepped forward toward the bus doors, and before boarding she looked back at him, not asking for permission, not offering invitation, simply acknowledging his presence. "We take this route every morning at 6:45, she said calmly. "If you decide to show up for him, not for yourself." Then she guided Noah onto the bus, the doors folding shut between them like a boundary drawn in steel and glass, leaving Ethan alone on the sidewalk with the first real decision of his life that could not be solved with money. The bus disappeared into the gray wash of morning traffic, but Ethan did not move. He stood there long after the red taillights dissolved into the city, the echo of Amara's words settling into him with a weight no headline had ever carried. Show up for him, not for yourself. It was a sentence simple enough for a child to understand, yet it unraveled years of carefully calculated decisions. By 8:30 he was seated at the head of a 40-foot glass conference table, skyline stretching. Behind him, executives outlining expansion projections in steady, confident voices, but every number felt distant, every graph irrelevant. When his chief financial officer mentioned volatility and brand perception, the phrase brand perception struck him with unexpected clarity, because for 5 years he had chosen perception over presence. He dismissed the meeting early, something he had never done without strategic cause, and retreated to his private office where the silence felt different from the silence on the sidewalk. It was controlled, insulated, obedient. He opened his laptop, not to review contracts, but to search for a kindergarten enrollment calendar in the district near that bus route. The simplicity of the task unsettled him. He did not know his son's school schedule, did not know his favorite subject, did not know whether he preferred cereal or toast in the morning. At noon he called his legal counsel, not to draft a statement, not to protect assets, but to request information about establishing paternity formally and responsibly. The attorney paused, surprised by the tone in Ethan's voice, because there was no urgency about containment, only clarity about responsibility. By late afternoon, Ethan found himself parked 1 block away from the same bus stop, engine off, watching from a respectful distance. He did not step out immediately. He waited, not wanting to intrude, rehearsing nothing because for once there was no script to deliver. When the bus arrived and the doors opened, Noah stepped down first, backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders, scanning the sidewalk until his eyes landed on Ethan's car. There was recognition this time, cautious but aware. Amara followed, her expression unreadable yet steady. Ethan exited the car slowly, hands visible, posture relaxed. He did not approach too quickly. He simply stood within reach and said, "I meant what I asked this morning. I want to do this the right way." Amara studied him for a long second, measuring not his words but the restraint behind them. "The right way takes time," she replied evenly. Noah shifted his weight and glanced between them, curious. Ethan crouched slightly again, maintaining distance. "Did you have a good day?" he asked, the question awkward yet sincere. Noah nodded once and answered softly, "We learned about planets." The detail felt like a gift. Ethan smiled, not the polished smile from investor presentations, but something quieter. "Which one is your favorite?" he asked. "Mars," Noah said without hesitation. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Mine too," he replied, and for the first time the connection did not feel forced. It felt earned in inches rather than miles. Amara adjusted Noah's coat and looked at Ethan with the same calm strength she had carried that morning. 6:45. She reminded him gently. Consistency matters. Ethan understood. This was not about grand gestures or public declarations. It was about mornings, about sidewalks, about showing up when no one was watching. and as they walked in opposite directions under the dimming Chicago sky, Ethan felt something unfamiliar yet undeniable settling into place. Not control, not redemption, but the beginning of accountability measured not in dollars, but in days. The next morning the sky over Chicago was still dark when Ethan parked half a block from the bus stop at 6:38, earlier than he needed to be, earlier than he had ever arrived anywhere without a driver and an agenda. The wind cut through the street like a warning, but he stayed outside the car this time, hands in his coat pockets, watching the faint glow of porch lights flicker on one by one. Consistency matters, Amara had said, and he understood that being early was not about impressing her. It was about proving to himself that this was not a passing impulse. At 6:44 she appeared at the corner, Noah's small hand tucked into hers, his backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. And when the boy spotted Ethan already waiting, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but recognition that this man had returned. Ethan offered a small wave, not stepping forward too quickly, allowing Noah to close the distance at his own pace. "You are early," Amara observed calmly, her breath visible in the cold air. "I wanted to be," Ethan answered simply. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic apologies, just the quiet rhythm of morning traffic and the soft scrape of shoes against concrete. Noah looked up at Ethan and said, "Mars is red because of iron," as if continuing a conversation from yesterday, without ceremony. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, grateful for the bridge the child was building. "That is right," he replied, kneeling slightly so. They were level again, and astronauts are training right now to go there one day. Noah's eyes widened just a little, curiosity outweighing caution, and Ethan felt the fragile thread between them strengthen. The bus arrived, and Ethan stepped back without being asked, giving them room, and before boarding, Noah hesitated, glancing at him once more. "Will you be here after school?" the boy asked quietly. The question was simple, but it carried more weight than any contract Ethan had ever signed. "Yes," he answered without hesitation, understanding that promises to a child were not projections, they were commitments. The bus doors closed, and Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the unfamiliar pressure of accountability settle deeper into his chest. Later that afternoon, when he returned to the same sidewalk, he noticed how ordinary everything looked, how no one else on the block knew that a billionaire was standing there measuring his life in minutes instead of millions. When Noah stepped off the bus and saw him waiting again, the boy's pace quickened by instinct, stopping, just short of running. Ethan felt the distance shrink by inches. Amara approached, watching carefully, not suspicious, but protective in a way that commanded respect. "This is not about proving something," she said evenly. "It is about staying." Ethan met her gaze and nodded. "Then I will stay," he replied, not as a declaration to win her back, but as a promise to the child who was already looking at him as if deciding whether to believe. And as they stood there beneath the fading afternoon light, Ethan understood that redemption did not arrive with applause. It arrived quietly at 6:45 in the morning and waited to see if he would keep showing up. The wind shifted sharply that Friday afternoon, colder than the forecast had predicted, and Ethan noticed the change before the bus even turned the corner. He had learned to watch for small signs now. The way Noah rubbed his chest lightly when the air felt tight, the subtle pause in his breathing when he laughed too hard. When the doors opened and Noah stepped down, his usual quick stride was slower, and Ethan felt his focus narrow instantly. "Hey, Mars expert," he said gently, keeping his voice calm. "Long day." Noah nodded but did not answer right away, his small shoulders rising and falling more noticeably than usual. Amara was close behind him, already alert, already assessing. "It is the cold," she said quietly, reaching into Noah's backpack with practiced efficiency. She pulled out a small inhaler, her movements steady, reassuring rather than urgent. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving space but not withdrawing, watching carefully, absorbing every detail. Noah took a measured breath as Amara guided him softly, and within seconds the tension in his posture eased. It was not dramatic, not chaotic, but it was real, and Ethan realized how many of these moments he had not been there for. When Noah looked up again, color returning to his cheeks, Ethan crouched down to his level. "You handled that like a pro," he said with a small smile. Noah shrugged faintly. As if bravery were simply routine, Amara zipped the backpack closed and met Ethan's eyes. "This is part of his life," she said evenly. "It is manageable, but it requires attention." Ethan nodded without defensiveness. "Then teach me," he replied. There was no pride in his voice, only willingness. They walked together toward the apartment building, not side by side in a picture of reconciliation, but in a quiet formation that felt practical and grounded. At the entrance, Noah looked between them and asked, "Are you coming tomorrow?" Ethan understood the deeper meaning beneath the question. Tomorrow was Saturday, no school, no bus schedule, just open hours. "If your mother agrees," he answered carefully, glancing at Amara. She studied him for a moment, measuring consistency against intention. "There is a science museum on Roosevelt Road," she said finally. "He likes the planetarium." The invitation was small but significant. Ethan felt gratitude rise without showing it too boldly. 10 in the morning, he suggested. Noah's face brightened at the idea, and for a second the world seemed simple. As they stepped into the warm glow of the building lobby, Ethan remained outside, watching the door close gently behind them. He did not feel excluded. He felt entrusted. The next morning he arrived 5 minutes early, not with gifts, not with cameras, just with time. And as he stood there under a pale winter sun, Ethan understood that fatherhood was not a title to reclaim but a presence to maintain, built one careful breath at a time, measured not in grand declarations but in moments when a child looks at you in uncertainty and you choose to stay. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of winter sunlight that made the city look softer than it felt, and Ethan was already standing outside the apartment building at 9:55, hands tucked into his coat, not checking his phone, not reviewing emails, just waiting. When the lobby door opened at exactly 10, Noah stepped out first, wearing a navy jacket zipped up to his chin and holding a folded museum map he must have printed from the website, and behind him Amara walked. With the same calm steadiness she carried everywhere, her eyes scanning the street out of habit. "You are on time," she said simply. "You said 10. Ethan replied, as if that were explanation enough. The drive to the Science Museum was quiet but not tense. Noah sitting in the back seat, pointing out buildings and asking questions about bridges and trains, and Ethan answering each one without rushing, aware that curiosity was not something to redirect, but something to protect. Inside the planetarium, the lights dimmed slowly until the ceiling turned into a deep canvas of stars, and for a moment Ethan forgot the boardrooms, the contracts, the weight of public expectations, because beside him Noah leaned forward in his seat, eyes wide, whispering the names of constellations as if greeting old friends. When Mars appeared in glowing red against the artificial night sky, Noah glanced sideways at Ethan with a grin that held no hesitation this time, only shared excitement. And Ethan felt the quiet privilege of being included in that look. Amara watched from the other side, her expression unreadable but softer around the edges, as if she were allowing herself to believe in small evidence rather than promises. After the show, they wandered through exhibits of rockets and satellites, and Noah insisted on reading every plaque aloud, stumbling over longer words but refusing help unless he asked for it. Ethan admired that determination, recognizing a familiar trait, but seeing it now as strength rather than stubbornness. At a hands-on display where children could simulate launching a spacecraft, Noah hesitated before pressing the button, glancing at Ethan for reassurance. Ethan did not reach over, did not take control. He simply nodded once, and Noah pressed it himself, watching the screen light up with animated stars. "You did that," Ethan said quietly. The pride in his voice was not exaggerated, not performative, just real. Later, as they sat at a small cafe table inside the museum, Noah sipping apple juice and talking about astronauts training for years before going into space, Amara looked at Ethan across the table and said, "This is the part that matters, not the headlines, not the court filings, just this." Ethan understood the layers beneath her words. Legal recognition was coming, paperwork already in motion, but fatherhood would not be secured by documents alone. It would be measured by mornings and museum visits, by learning inhaler schedules and favorite planets, by choosing to stay when schedules became inconvenient. When they walked back into the crisp afternoon air, Noah slipped his small hand into Ethan's without being prompted, the gesture natural, unforced, and Ethan felt the gravity of it more than any public accolade. He was not reclaiming a title, he was earning a place, one quiet Saturday at a time. By Monday morning, the routine no longer felt fragile, it felt intentional, and Ethan stood at the bus stop at 6:45 with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that consistency was no longer a test but a standard. The winter air carried a sharper edge, and Noah wore a thicker scarf, his breath visible as he talked about an upcoming class presentation on the solar system. "I am doing mine on Mars," he said proudly, shifting his backpack higher on his shoulders. Ethan smiled, gently. "Are you going to talk about the iron oxide?" he asked. Noah grinned, pleased that he remembered. Amara watched the exchange without interruption, her posture relaxed but observant, and there was something different in the silence between her and Ethan now. Not tension, not forgiveness, but a developing trust built on repetition rather than apology. That afternoon, however, the balance shifted. As the bus pulled away and Noah stepped onto the sidewalk, he seemed quieter than usual, his shoulders drawn inward. Before Ethan could ask, Noah coughed lightly, the sound subtle but persistent. Amara immediately knelt to his level, her movements calm, her voice steady. Slow breaths, she reminded him softly. Ethan felt the instinct to react quickly, to take control, but he remembered what Amara had shown him before, and instead he stayed close without crowding them. Noah reached for his inhaler on his own this time, following the rhythm his mother had taught him, and Ethan realized, with a quiet ache, how many evenings Amara had handled this alone. When Noah's breathing settled, Ethan spoke carefully. "Would you like me to walk you upstairs today?" The offer was simple, not an attempt to replace, only to assist. Noah looked up at his mother first, waiting for approval, and when she nodded once, he slipped his hand into Ethan's. The stairwell of the apartment building echoed softly with their footsteps, and for the first time Ethan crossed the threshold beyond the lobby, not as a visitor claiming space, but as someone invited. Inside the apartment, the warmth wrapped around them, and Ethan noticed the small details he had only imagined before: drawings taped to the refrigerator, a calendar marked with school events, a neat row of medicine on the kitchen counter. Amara placed Noah's backpack down and looked at Ethan directly. "He has a parent-teacher conference on Thursday at 4, she said. "If you are serious about staying, you should be there." There was no challenge in her tone, only clarity. Ethan did not check his schedule, did not calculate the inconvenience. "I will be there," he answered. Later that evening, as he left the building and stepped back into the cold Chicago night, he felt the weight of responsibility more solid than ever, not because of obligation, but because he had been allowed inside the life he once abandoned. And as the city lights reflected against the dark lake in the distance, Ethan understood that redemption was no longer a distant goal. It was unfolding in quiet rooms, in measured breaths, in conferences at 4 in the afternoon, and he intended to be present for every single one. Thursday arrived with a clear sky and a sharper wind, and at 3:55 in the afternoon Ethan stood outside the elementary school with the same steady posture he once reserved for shareholder meetings, except this time there were no cameras, no assistants, just the sound of children's voices echoing across the playground. When Amara approached with Noah beside her, she did not look surprised to see him already waiting, only observant, as if confirming that 4 o'clock meant 4 o'clock. Inside the classroom, small desks were arranged in careful rows, colorful drawings of planets taped along the walls, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar humility as he sat in a chair built for someone half his size. Noah's teacher smiled warmly and spoke about his curiosity, his focus, his determination to finish every assignment even when breathing became difficult. "He does not give up easily," she said kindly. Ethan glanced at Noah, recognizing that quiet resilience, and felt both pride and regret move through him at the same time. After the conference, they stepped back into the hallway where the late afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, and Noah tugged gently at Ethan's sleeve. "Did you hear that?" he asked, eyes bright. "She said I do not give up." Ethan knelt slightly, meeting his gaze. "I heard," he replied softly, "and I believe it." There was no applause, no dramatic shift, only the steady unfolding of something earned. Outside, As parents and children dispersed into waiting cars and buses, Noah paused on the sidewalk between them, looking up at Ethan with a seriousness that felt older than his years. For a brief second, the city noise faded again, just as it had that first morning at the bus stop. "Are you coming tomorrow?" Noah asked quietly. Ethan did not hesitate this time. "Yes," he answered, his voice grounded not in ambition but in certainty. Noah studied him for a heartbeat longer. Then something softened in his expression, something that had been guarded for weeks. He stepped closer, small hand reaching for Ethan's coat, and in a voice that carried no hesitation at all, he said, "Okay, Dad." The word was not loud, not dramatic, but it settled into Ethan's chest with more impact than any public title he had ever held. Amara stood a few feet away, watching carefully, and though her face remained composed, there was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes, not of reconciliation, but of recognition. Ethan did not look at her for approval. He kept his eyes on Noah, understanding that this was the proof that mattered. Not DNA results filed in a courthouse, not legal documents stamped with official seals, but a child choosing to trust him. As they began walking toward the car under the fading afternoon light, Ethan felt the gravity of the moment settle into something steady and lasting. Fatherhood had not been reclaimed in a single confession or secured by wealth. It had been built in mornings at 6:45, in museum visits, in inhaler lessons, in conferences at 4 in the afternoon, and now, in the quiet echo of one simple word. He understood that staying was no longer a promise he was trying to keep. It was who he had chosen to become.